The first warning came from the sky over Vietnam, not from a radar screen, not from a spy satellite, not from a classified intelligence report. It came from a small jet fighter that, on paper, should have been yesterday's technology, the MiG-17. It was slower than America's newest fighters. It carried no sophisticated American-style radar system. It was relatively short-ranged. It was armed with guns. And compared with the enormous, powerful American aircraft entering the skies over Vietnam, the MiG-17 looked almost primitive. But that was exactly what made it dangerous. Because war does not care what looks advanced on a specification sheet. It cares about what works. And over North Vietnam, the MiG-17 had found a fight it was built to win. American pilots were flying aircraft designed around speed, altitude, radar, missiles, and long-range engagement. The North Vietnamese were often flying a very different kind of fight. They waited. They climbed. They hid among the terrain and clouds. They attacked when they had an advantage. And when the fight collapsed into a turning engagement, the MiG-17 could become something American pilots learned to respect very quickly. A tight-turning gunfighter. A small target, a dangerous opponent, and in the confusion of Vietnam's skies, a fighter that could appear almost suddenly, turn inside an American aircraft, fire its guns, and disappear before the American pilot could fully understand what had happened. The United States had enormous technological advantages, but technology does not automatically produce victory. And the MiG-17 was about to teach the American military one of the most uncomfortable lessons of the Vietnam War. You cannot defeat an enemy aircraft effectively if you don't truly understand how it fights. So American intelligence began looking for something extraordinary. Not another report. Not another photograph. Not another captured component. America needed the actual airplane. They needed to climb inside it. They needed to start its engine. They needed American pilots to fly it. And most importantly, they needed American pilots to fight it. That meant doing something almost unbelievable. The United States would secretly take a Soviet-designed MiG-17, bring it into an extremely restricted American test program, and put it into the hands of American pilots. Then they would point American fighters at it, and see what happened. What happened next would change the way America trained for air combat. The Vietnam sky. By the middle years of the Vietnam War, American air power was operating on a scale few conflicts had ever seen. The United States possessed aircraft capable of flying enormous distances with heavy weapons loads. The F-4 Phantom II was fast, powerful, and heavily armed. American planners expected that advanced technology would help dominate the air. But Vietnam was not producing the clean, long-range missile war many had imagined. The skies were complicated. Rules of engagement mattered. Political restrictions mattered. Weather mattered. Terrain mattered. And the enemy mattered. North Vietnam's People's Air Force was smaller than the American air arm confronting it. But smaller did not mean helpless. Its fighter force included Soviet-designed MiG-17s and later MiG-21s. The MiG-17 was especially interesting. It was derived from the earlier MiG-15 family and represented a generation of jet fighter design created around one central idea: get into a close fight, turn hard, put guns on the enemy. The aircraft's design was not built around the assumption that every engagement would happen dozens of miles away. It was built for the brutal geometry of visual combat. And the MiG-17 had one characteristic that could make an American pilot's life miserable: could turn. Very well. That mattered because the American fighter philosophy had increasingly emphasized speed, altitude, radar, missiles, and heavy weapons. The problem was that the Vietnam battlefield often forced those advantages into a much smaller arena. A pilot might detect an opponent too late. A missile might not be usable under the circumstances. The engagement might collapse into visual range. And suddenly the American pilot was no longer fighting the battle the airplane had been designed to fight. He was fighting the battle the MiG wanted. A turning fight, a gun fight, a knife fight in the sky. And that was where the little Soviet fighter could become terrifying. The myth of the obsolete MiG. There was a dangerous assumption surrounding the MiG-17. It looked old. Therefore, some people assumed it was inferior. That assumption was wrong. The MiG-17 did not need to be better at everything. It only needed to be extremely good at the part of the fight it was designed to dominate. The aircraft had a swept wing, a relatively compact body, and a design optimized for high-speed maneuvering. At lower speeds, its handling characteristics could give it a powerful advantage in a turning engagement, and its weapons were brutally simple. Cannon. No complicated missile seeker. No sophisticated engagement envelope. No elaborate electronic architecture. Just guns. The simplicity could become an advantage, because if an American fighter lost the opportunity to use its technological advantages, the fight could become brutally primitive. Turn, pull, fire, survive. The American aircraft might be more advanced, but the MiG-17 didn't care. It only cared whether it could get its nose pointed at the American jet. And in the skies over Vietnam, American pilots were learning that getting the nose of a fighter onto an enemy target was sometimes much harder than it looked. The Phantom's problem. The F-4 Phantom II was one of the most impressive combat aircraft of its generation. It was fast, powerful, large, heavily armed, and designed to fight at high speed. But early versions of the Phantom had no internal cannon. The assumption was that missiles had made traditional dogfighting guns less important. The future, many believed, belonged to radar-guided and heat-seeking missiles. But Vietnam exposed a problem. Missiles did not always work. Engagement rules could restrict their use. The geometry could be wrong. The target might be too close. The target might be too maneuverable. And sometimes the aircraft would simply find itself in a situation where the pilot needed a gun. The problem was that the Phantom had been designed around a different concept. It was a missile truck, a radar fighter, a high-performance machine intended to engage the enemy before the fight became a traditional turning battle. But the MiG-17 was perfectly comfortable with the traditional turning battle. That mismatch created a dangerous situation. America had the better machine for some fights. North Vietnam had the better machine for another. And the battlefield had a habit of deciding which fight happened. The secret begins. Then, thousands of miles from Vietnam, intelligence officers got an extraordinary opportunity. In 1968, a Syrian MiG-17 landed in northern Israel after its pilot mistakenly believed he had reached Lebanon. The aircraft ended up in Israeli hands. And suddenly, the West had access to something it desperately wanted. A Soviet-designed fighter that could be examined from the inside out. Israel transferred the aircraft to the United States. The Americans gave it new identities. They treated it as a classified asset. And eventually, the aircraft made its way into one of the most secretive aviation environments in America. Groom Lake, Nevada. Area 51. The desert was almost perfect, far from civilian eyes, surrounded by restricted airspace, large enough to conduct dangerous flight tests, and secret enough that very few people needed to know what was actually happening. The program became known as Have Drill. Its purpose was not simply to admire the enemy aircraft, it was to understand it. American pilots would fly the MiG. They would fight against it. They would study its strengths. They would search for its weaknesses. And they would learn what it felt like from inside the cockpit. For American air combat doctrine, this was potentially priceless. Because intelligence reports could tell you what a MiG was supposed to do. But only another pilot flying the airplane could show you what it actually did. A Soviet fighter over America. Imagine the scene. The Nevada desert. Heat shimmering above the runway. A restricted airfield hidden behind mountains and miles of empty desert. And sitting on the ramp is something that officially should not be there. A Soviet-designed MiG-17. Not a photograph. Not a wreck. Not a museum artifact. A working fighter. The enemy aircraft that American pilots had been fighting over Vietnam was now sitting inside America's most secret test environment. And American pilots were about to do something that would have sounded impossible to the public. They would fly it. They would learn its cockpit. They would learn its controls. They would learn how it accelerated, how it turned, how quickly it lost energy, how it behaved at different speeds, how much control authority the pilot had, and then they would fight it. That last part was the most important, because a fighter can look impressive on the ground. A manual can explain its specifications, but combat reveals the truth, and the truth came fast. The first dogfights. American pilots began flying against the MiG-17, and the results were startling. The aircraft that had been treated by some as an old design suddenly looked very dangerous. According to accounts of Have Drill, Navy pilots who flew against the MiG-17 failed to defeat it during their first engagement. That was not what many expected. The MiG was old. The American aircraft were newer. The Americans had tremendous technological advantages. Yet the little MiG repeatedly demonstrated that it could create problems in the kind of fight where maneuverability mattered most. The reason was brutally simple. The MiG-17 could turn inside the opponent. If the American pilot entered the engagement incorrectly, the MiG could exploit it. The American fighter might have more power, more speed, better systems, but none of that mattered if the MiG was already sitting behind it. This was the moment the American military began to confront a painful truth. The MiG-17 wasn't unbeatable. It was misunderstood. And those were two very different problems. The moment the pilots understood, a dogfight is not just about aircraft performance. It is about human decisions. A pilot sees an enemy. The pilot reacts. The enemy reacts to that reaction. The fight becomes a chain of decisions happening at extreme speed. If the pilot misunderstands what the enemy aircraft can do, the first mistake can become fatal. American pilots had been trained to exploit the strengths of American aircraft, but if they didn't understand the MiG's strengths, they could accidentally place themselves exactly where the MiG wanted them. The secret aircraft in Nevada became a teacher. It showed American pilots what the MiG looked like from behind, what it looked like from the front, how quickly it could rotate, how aggressively it could change direction, how much energy it lost, and perhaps most importantly what it could not do, because every strength creates a weakness. The MiG could turn tightly, but hard turning could cost energy. Its simple controls were not always as forgiving. Its performance was not equally impressive at every speed and altitude, and its engine did not give it unlimited acceleration. The Americans had found the key. The MiG had teeth, but it also had limits. The secret wasn't to make the MiG look bad. This is where the story becomes more interesting. The purpose of the program wasn't to prove American aircraft were superior. It was to discover the truth. If the MiG was better in a certain situation, American pilots needed to know that. If the MiG was vulnerable in another situation, they needed to know that too. This was not about national pride. It was about survival. And that meant American pilots had to learn how to stop giving the MiG the fight it wanted. The answer was not necessarily to turn harder. It was often to avoid the turning fight altogether. Use speed. Use energy. Use altitude. Use teamwork. Use the strengths of the American aircraft. Force the MiG to fight outside its ideal envelope. The MiG-17 was extremely dangerous when an American pilot allowed the engagement to become a slow, tight, close-range turning contest. But if the American fighter could preserve its energy and use superior acceleration and speed, the situation changed. The question became, who controls the geometry? That was the real secret. The fighter pilot's nightmare. For the American pilot, the most dangerous thing about the MiG-17 wasn't necessarily its gun. It was its ability to appear harmless. The aircraft could look slow, could look old, it could look technologically inferior, and that could encourage an American pilot to underestimate it. That psychological trap was almost as dangerous as the aircraft itself. A pilot who expects an easy victory can enter the engagement carelessly. A pilot who believes the enemy is inferior may accept a turning fight that should have been avoided. And once the MiG got inside the American fighter's turn, the situation could change in seconds. The MiG pilot didn't need to outrun the American jet. He didn't need to climb higher. He didn't need to carry a bigger missile. He only needed a firing position. The aircraft's 323mm cannons could deliver a devastating burst. And at close range, a few seconds was an eternity. The invisible war inside the dogfight. There was another dimension to have drill. The Americans were not merely learning how to defeat a MiG. They were learning how to think like the enemy. That sounds simple. It wasn't. A pilot trained entirely on friendly aircraft can develop assumptions about what another aircraft can and cannot do. Those assumptions become instinct. And instinct is extremely powerful in combat. But instinct based on incorrect assumptions can kill. The MiG program challenged those assumptions. American pilots learned that an enemy fighter might behave differently than their own. It might enter a turn at a different speed. It might lose energy differently. It might recover differently. Its pilot might use different tactics. And once American pilots understood that, the MiG stopped being a mysterious enemy. It became a system, a machine with capabilities, a machine with limitations, a machine that could be beaten. The Area 51 connection. The location itself added another layer of secrecy. Groom Lake was already associated with America's most sensitive aircraft programs. The desert provided isolation. The airspace could be restricted. The roads were controlled. The horizon was empty. And inside that environment, foreign fighters could be tested without the public knowing what was happening. The HAV programs became part of a broader effort to understand Soviet aircraft. HAV Drill focused on the MiG-17. HAV Donut involved a MiG-21. The Americans were effectively creating a private laboratory for enemy aviation. And the laboratory had one major advantage. It could produce something no intelligence report could provide. Experience. Real experience. American pilots could fight a real MiG. They could make mistakes against it. They could learn from those mistakes. Then they could carry those lessons back to other pilots. The program was so sensitive that knowledge of the MiG's presence was restricted even within the U.S. military. The airspace over Groom Lake became a place where American pilots could fight Soviet-designed aircraft without the world knowing. And in the desert, the Vietnam Air War was being recreated. The fight that never happened over Vietnam. There is something almost surreal about the idea. A pilot in Nevada could climb into a Soviet fighter, take off over the desert, and then turn toward an American F-4 Phantom. The aircraft could represent two opposing sides of the Cold War. One machine built in the Soviet sphere, the other built in the United States. But the pilots were Americans, and the goal wasn't to destroy anything. The goal was to learn. The American pilot in the Phantom could experience the exact problem facing pilots over Vietnam. A MiG turning toward him, the MiG pulling tighter. The American pilot trying to maintain position. The MiG forcing the engagement into a geometry where its maneuverability became an advantage. Then the American pilot could do it again, and again, and again. Except this time, losing the fight didn't mean dying. It meant learning. That was the genius of the program. Combat had been turned into a laboratory. The lesson of the first loss. The first time an American pilot lost to a MiG in training, the result could be embarrassing. But embarrassment was useful. In actual combat, the lesson came after a missile hit or cannon burst. At Groom Lake, the lesson came after the aircraft landed. The pilot could climb out, walk into a briefing room, sit with engineers and instructors, and ask the most important question in aviation. What? Why did the MiG get behind me? Why couldn't I force it out of the turn? Why did I lose energy? Why did my missile opportunity disappear? Why did I enter the fight at that speed? Why did I allow the MiG to dictate the geometry? And then the instructors could show the answer. That process transformed the MiG from a threat into a textbook, a living textbook. The MiG's secret weapon wasn't the engine, it wasn't the guns, it wasn't the wings, it wasn't some mysterious Soviet technology. The MiG-17's greatest weapon in Vietnam was the ability to exploit mistakes. That is what makes the story so important. The MiG didn't need to be superior in every category. It needed the American pilot to fight incorrectly. If the American pilot turned too tightly and bled energy, the MiG could capitalize. If the American pilot slowed down too much, the MiG could capitalize. If the American pilot underestimated it, the MiG could capitalize. If the American pilot entered a classic turning engagement, the MiG could capitalize. The Americans eventually realized that the MiG's maneuverability was not a problem to be matched. It was a problem to be avoided. That distinction would change everything, from dogfight to doctrine. The lessons from these secret tests eventually fed into broader American fighter training. The United States began putting greater emphasis on realistic air combat maneuvering and dissimilar aircraft training. Instead of assuming American fighters were naturally superior, pilots had to practice against aircraft that behaved differently. They needed to understand what an enemy fighter would do. They needed to recognize dangerous situations before entering them. And they needed to exploit their own aircraft strengths. This was a major philosophical shift. The lesson was no longer, our fighter is better. The lesson became, our fighter is better if we use it correctly. That sounds like a small difference. It wasn't. It was the difference between technology and tactics. And Vietnam had shown that tactics could determine whether technology mattered. The Phantom learns to fight differently. The F-4 Phantom was not suddenly transformed into a MiG-17. It didn't need to be. The goal was to make the Phantom fight like a Phantom, use its strengths, avoid unnecessary low-speed turning contests, maintain energy, exploit acceleration, use teamwork, create favorable engagement geometry, and understand the enemy before the enemy understands you. The Phantom had enormous power. The MiG had maneuverability. So American tactics had to prevent the MiG from turning that maneuverability into a decisive advantage. This was the essence of dissimilar air combat training. You don't beat an opponent by pretending he has the same strengths you do. You beat him by understanding the differences. The numbers tell the story. The results were significant. According to documented accounts of the HAV drill program, the U.S. Navy's kill ratio against MiG-17s improved dramatically after tactics were revised, rising from roughly 2.75 to 1 earlier in the war to approximately 8.33 to 1 later in the conflict. That number isn't simply a statistic. It represents a change in thinking. The enemy aircraft hadn't suddenly become obsolete. The Americans had learned how to fight it. The MiG-17 was still capable of turning. It was still dangerous. It still carried guns. But American pilots were no longer entering the fight blind. They understood what the MiG wanted, and they understood how to deny it. That was the real victory. Not destroying the aircraft, understanding it. The pilots who flew the enemy. There is another remarkable element to the story. The Americans weren't simply studying the MiG from a distance. They were becoming familiar with it. They could experience its cockpit, its instruments, its visibility, its control forces, its acceleration, its handling, and that created something intelligence analysts couldn't reproduce. Empathy. Not emotional empathy, tactical empathy. The ability to imagine what the enemy pilot was seeing. If an American pilot knew that the MiG's pilot had limited visibility in a certain direction, that mattered. If he knew how quickly the MiG could turn at a particular speed, that mattered. If he knew how rapidly the aircraft lost energy in a hard maneuver, that mattered. If he knew what the MiG couldn't do, that mattered even more. Because air combat is a contest of information. The pilot who knows more has options. The pilot who knows less is reacting. And reaction is dangerous when two aircraft are moving hundreds of miles per hour. The MiG that became a mirror. The captured MiG became something more than an enemy aircraft. It became a mirror. It showed the United States what its own assumptions looked like from the other side. America believed its technology could dominate. The MiG asked, "Can your technology help you if you don't know how to use it?" America believed its aircraft were powerful. The MiG asked, "Can power help you if you allow the enemy to get inside your turn?" America believed missiles would define modern air combat. The MiG asked, "What happens when the fight becomes too close for your ideal weapon?" The answers were uncomfortable, but they were valuable, because the most dangerous lesson in war is the lesson you refuse to learn. Why the secret had to stay secret. The United States could not simply announce that it possessed a Soviet fighter. The aircraft was intelligence. Its existence was sensitive. Its performance was sensitive. Its evaluation was sensitive. The knowledge being gathered from it could help American forces understand Soviet aircraft in Vietnam and potentially elsewhere. So the program operated behind layers of secrecy. The aircraft received American designations and false serial information. The test area was isolated. The pilots involved were carefully selected. And the MiG's presence wasn't something every American pilot at nearby bases was supposed to know about. The irony was extraordinary. American pilots were secretly fighting Soviet aircraft in the Nevada desert so that other American pilots could fight Soviet aircraft in Southeast Asia. The desert became a hidden extension of the Vietnam Air War. The MiG-17's great advantage. The MiG-17's advantage was not that it was better than the F-4. It was that it was different. That difference forced the Americans to adapt. Its strengths were concentrated in close-range maneuvering. Its simplicity made it a very different opponent from the complex American aircraft, and its behavior challenged pilots who had trained primarily against American-style aircraft. That is why the captured MiG was so valuable. An American pilot could spend hours studying an enemy aircraft, but nothing replaces actually seeing it maneuver. Nothing replaces watching it turn. Nothing replaces trying to get behind it. Nothing replaces having it turn inside you. That experience can rewrite instinct, and that was exactly what the United States needed. The Air War's biggest lesson, the Vietnam Air War, eventually taught a lesson that would influence American military aviation for decades. Air superiority is not simply a question of aircraft technology. It is a combination of technology, training, tactics, intelligence, teamwork, and experience. The United States had some of the world's most advanced combat aircraft, but the enemy had studied how to use its own aircraft effectively. The Americans had to do the same. The HAF programs represented a turning point. The United States began taking dissimilar air combat more seriously. Pilots needed to fight aircraft that didn't behave like their own. They needed to experience surprise. They needed to make mistakes in training, and they needed to discover those mistakes before encountering them in combat. That philosophy would eventually become central to the American approach to fighter training, the birth of a new kind of training. The secret MiG programs did not end with one aircraft in the Nevada desert. Their lessons continued. The United States increasingly recognized the value of realistic adversary training. Pilots needed to fight aircraft representing enemy tactics rather than simply fly against friendly aircraft. This philosophy would eventually contribute to the development of major training organizations and exercises designed around realistic combat. The point was simple. Train against the enemy before meeting the enemy. Discover the enemy's tricks before those tricks are used against you. And learn to recognize the difference between a dangerous situation and a survivable one. The MiG-17 had helped teach that lesson. The MiG didn't win the war. It is important not to turn the story into a myth. The MiG-17 did not somehow defeat American air power. It didn't. The United States remained capable of overwhelming force. American aviation technology was extraordinarily advanced, and the MiG-17 had serious limitations. But that's exactly what makes its story so fascinating. It didn't need to win the entire war. It only needed to win the wrong engagement. A single turning fight. A single mistake. A single moment when an American pilot underestimated an aircraft that looked obsolete. That's enough. Because in air combat, the difference between victory and disaster can be measured in seconds. The MiG's weakness. The secret tests revealed something just as important as the MiG's maneuverability. The aircraft had weaknesses. Its controls were relatively simple. Its engine performance had limits. Its ability to accelerate away from certain situations was not comparable to the performance available to American fighters. And the aircraft could lose energy rapidly when forced into hard maneuvering. That meant the MiG could be beaten, but it had to be beaten intelligently. The American pilot had to resist the instinct to chase the MiG into the exact kind of fight it wanted. Instead, he had to control the engagement. That meant maintaining energy, using speed, forcing the MiG to react, and refusing to give the enemy a free advantage. It was not glamorous. It was not as simple as saying one aircraft was faster. It was a contest of energy management, position, timing, discipline, and patience. The pilot who refuses the turn. Imagine two fighters closing. The American pilot sees the MiG. The MiG turns. The instinct is immediate. Turn with it. But that's the trap. The MiG is telling the American pilot, "Come fight me where I am strongest." The American pilot now has a choice. Follow or refuse. If he follows, the fight may become a slow turning contest. If he refuses, the MiG has to deal with the American fighter's energy and speed advantage. That is the kind of lesson that sounds obvious after someone explains it, but at hundreds of miles per hour with another fighter trying to kill you, obvious becomes complicated. The purpose of training was to make the correct response instinctive. That is what the secret MiG was teaching. The real weapon was knowledge. The United States did not need to steal the MiG's technology and copy it. It needed to understand it. That distinction is important. The most valuable information wasn't necessarily a component or a secret material. It was knowledge. Knowledge of how the aircraft behaved. Knowledge of how it fought. Knowledge of where it was dangerous. Knowledge of where it was vulnerable. And knowledge of how an American pilot could survive. In that sense, the captured MiG was a weapon without firing a shot. Every time it flew against an American aircraft, it produced information. Every American pilot who learned from the encounter carried that information forward. And every pilot who learned how to defeat the MiG became a living training manual for the next generation. The secret that helped change Top Gun. The Navy's fighter training culture was deeply influenced by the lessons of Vietnam. The realization was unavoidable. American pilots needed more realistic training. They needed to practice against dissimilar opponents. They needed to understand maneuvering combat, and they needed instructors who could teach pilots how to survive beyond the classroom. The secret MiG evaluations became part of that broader transformation. The lessons from the HAV programs were passed into fighter weapons training. The goal was not simply to teach pilots how to fly better. It was to teach them how to fight better. And there is a huge difference. A pilot can be an excellent aviator and still be poorly prepared for an air combat engagement. The American military wanted pilots who understood both. Fly the airplane, then fight the airplane. Why this mattered beyond Vietnam. The importance of HAV drill extended beyond the Vietnam War. The United States was preparing for a Cold War in which Soviet-designed aircraft would remain a major threat. The MiG-17 was only one member of a much larger family of Soviet fighters. The MiG-21 was faster. Later Soviet designs would become more sophisticated. If American pilots were going to fight them, the United States needed a systematic way to understand them. The secret MiG program helped establish that mindset. Get the aircraft, study the aircraft, fly the aircraft, fight the aircraft, teach the lessons, repeat. That cycle became an important part of American air power culture. The desert became a classroom. There is something cinematic about the image of the Nevada desert. No jungle, no monsoon clouds, no Vietnamese villages below. No surface-to-air missiles waiting in the distance. Just mountains, dry air, and a forbidden runway. But above that desert, American pilots were learning how to survive the skies of Vietnam. The aircraft were real. The danger in the training was controlled. And the lessons were brutally realistic. The MiG would turn. The American fighter would respond. The instructors would watch. The pilots would land. And then the fight would be dissected. Every mistake mattered. Every successful maneuver mattered. Every assumption was challenged. This was not a normal training exercise. It was intelligence gathering through experience. The most humbling part, perhaps the most humbling aspect of the entire story, was that American pilots didn't always win. They were among the most highly trained aviators in the world. They were flying advanced aircraft. They had tremendous institutional resources behind them. Yet when they first met the MiG-17 in controlled combat, the results could be ugly. That was valuable, because it forced American aviation to confront a truth that every military organization eventually has to face. Your reputation doesn't matter to the enemy. Your budget doesn't matter. Your technology doesn't matter if you don't know how to use it. The MiG did not care that the Phantom was bigger. It did not care that American engineers had built a remarkable machine. It did not care how many stars were on the general's shoulders. The MiG only cared about geometry. If it could turn inside the American fighter, it had a chance. That brutal simplicity made the lesson unforgettable. When the hunter became the hunted, there is a psychological transformation that occurs when a pilot realizes the enemy aircraft is better at something. The hunter becomes cautious. The confident pilot becomes disciplined. The fighter becomes less aggressive, and that can save a life. The secret MiG taught American pilots respect, not fear. Respect. There is a difference. Fear makes you hesitate. Respect makes you understand. Once pilots understood what the MiG could do, they could plan around it. They could avoid its strengths. They could attack its weaknesses. They could deny it the kind of engagement where it was most dangerous. The MiG stopped being an unknown. An unknown is often the most dangerous weapon of all. The long-term legacy. Years later, the American military would continue using foreign aircraft to train against its own pilots. The philosophy of realistic adversary training expanded. Eventually, the United States would operate secret squadrons whose pilots flew captured or acquired foreign fighters. Those programs became legendary inside American aviation. But the story begins earlier. It begins with the realization that American pilots needed to fight something that didn't behave like an American airplane. The MiG-17 was one of the aircraft that made that realization impossible to ignore. And the lessons were bigger than one war. They became part of a culture built around the idea that the enemy should be studied honestly, not underestimated, not romanticized, not dismissed, studied. The strange journey of a Syrian MiG. Think about how strange the aircraft's journey was. It was born from Soviet engineering. It entered service in a Middle Eastern Air Force. Its pilot became disoriented. The aircraft landed in Israel. Israel transferred it to the United States. American intelligence acquired it. The aircraft was secretly transported to America. Then it appeared in the Nevada desert. And there, American pilots climbed inside it. The same basic type of aircraft that American pilots were trying to defeat over Vietnam was now helping train them in the United States. That is one of the great ironies of Cold War aviation. Sometimes the best way to understand an enemy is to make the enemy's weapon your teacher. The day the MiG stopped being a mystery. Before Have Drill, the MiG-17 existed in American minds as a collection of reports, photographs, pilot accounts, combat reports, intelligence assessments. But reports can only go so far. Then the Americans had the aircraft itself, and suddenly the questions became physical. How does it feel? How does it turn? What does the pilot see? What does it sound like? How quickly does it lose energy? How does it respond when pushed? What happens when it is forced outside its ideal conditions? These weren't theoretical questions anymore. The answers were happening in the sky. And once the answers were known, the MiG became less mysterious. That was perhaps the most important victory of all. The aircraft that taught America humility. The MiG-17 didn't teach America that Soviet aircraft were superior. It taught America something more useful. Never assume. Never assume the older aircraft is harmless. Never assume technology automatically wins. Never assume the enemy will fight the battle you want. And never assume a pilot understands an aircraft simply because he knows its name. The United States had to experience the MiG before it could truly understand the MiG. That experience was expensive in Vietnam. The secret test program allowed America to buy that knowledge in the desert without paying for it with more pilots' lives. That was the genius of Have Drill, the final dogfight. Picture the final training engagement. A MiG-17 is ahead. The American fighter closes. The MiG turns. For a moment, the old instinct returns. Follow it. Turn harder. But the American pilot knows better now. He knows the trap. He knows the MiG wants the fight to slow down. He knows the MiG wants to turn inside him. He knows that if he gives the MiG that opportunity, the little Soviet fighter can become lethal. So he refuses. He keeps his energy. He uses his aircraft's advantages. He controls the geometry. And suddenly the MiG is no longer the hunter. It is reacting. That is the moment the training has succeeded. Not because the American fighter is magically better, but because the American pilot finally understands the opponent. The MiG has lost its greatest advantage. Surprise. The secret war that helped win the next war. Have Drill remained classified for decades. The details were not something the public could easily see. For years, the story existed behind locked doors, restricted airspace, classified reports, and carefully controlled information. But the lessons did not disappear. They moved through American fighter training. They influenced tactics. They influenced weapons school thinking. They influenced the idea that pilots should train against realistic enemy aircraft and tactics. And eventually the secrecy began to fade. The public could finally see pieces of a story that had been hidden in the Nevada desert. A Soviet fighter had flown over America. American pilots had fought it, and the experience had helped reshape the way America trained for aerial combat. What the MiG-17 really won. So did North Vietnam's MiG-17 really own the dogfight? For a time, in the right circumstances, it could absolutely dominate the kind of close-range engagement it was designed for. But the deeper story is more interesting than a simple victory or defeat. The MiG-17 forced America to change. That is its real legacy. It exposed the danger of relying on assumptions. It showed that missiles could not replace every aspect of fighter combat. It demonstrated that maneuverability still mattered. It revealed the importance of realistic training. And it pushed American pilots toward a more sophisticated understanding of air combat. The United States didn't beat the MiG by building a bigger MiG. It beat the MiG by learning not to fight it on the MiG's terms. That is the lesson. The old fighter that changed modern air combat. The MiG-17 was not the fastest fighter. It wasn't the most advanced. It wasn't the most heavily armed. It didn't possess the technology that would define later generations of air combat, but it had something that made it extremely dangerous. It had a design optimized for a specific fight, and it exposed a weakness in American thinking. The Americans had built extraordinary aircraft, but extraordinary aircraft still needed extraordinary training. The secret MiG gave them that training, and the result reached far beyond the Nevada desert. It became part of a larger American evolution in fighter tactics. The United States began to understand that air superiority isn't something you inherit. You earn it, again and again, through training, through intelligence, through experimentation, and sometimes through the uncomfortable experience of losing a simulated dogfight against the aircraft you thought you already understood. The final image. Today the idea sounds almost unbelievable. A Soviet fighter, flying secretly over the American desert. American pilots chasing it. American engineers studying it. American instructors learning from it. And all of it happening because a war thousands of miles away had exposed a problem that couldn't be solved on paper. The MiG-17 had become more than an enemy. It became a teacher. And perhaps that is the greatest irony of the entire story. The United States did not defeat the MiG-17 by pretending it was obsolete. It defeated it by taking it seriously, by studying it, by flying it, by fighting it, and by learning exactly what the aircraft could do before asking American pilots to defeat it. That lesson would echo through American military aviation for decades, because the greatest advantage in aerial combat isn't always speed. It isn't always altitude. It isn't always missiles. It isn't even always technology. Sometimes the greatest advantage is knowing what the other pilot is about to do. And in the Nevada desert, America found a way to learn. The enemy's fighter became the classroom. The dogfight became the laboratory. And the MiG-17, once feared over North Vietnam, became one of the most valuable teachers American air combat ever had. The secret was never that America had discovered a magical way to make the MiG-17 harmless. The secret was much simpler. America had finally learned how to fight it. And once you understand the enemy's strengths, the battlefield changes. The aircraft is the same. The sky is the same. The guns are the same. But the pilot is different. And sometimes that is all it takes. Because in the end, the MiG-17 didn't lose because it suddenly became a bad airplane. It lost because the Americans stopped giving it the fight it wanted. That was the real turning point. Not a new missile. Not a new engine. Not a new fighter. Knowledge. Knowledge gained in secret. Knowledge carried from a captured aircraft in Israel to a restricted airfield in Nevada. Knowledge turned into tactics. Tactics turned into training. Training turned into survival. And survival turned into air superiority. The MiG had once forced American pilots to respect the dogfight. The captured MiG taught them how to win it. And somewhere over the silent Nevada desert, behind a wall of secrecy that lasted for decades, the Cold War's strangest classroom had done its job. The American pilot climbed out. The MiG remained behind. The lesson remained. And the next time an American fighter met a MiG in the sky over Vietnam, the American pilot was no longer meeting a mystery. He was meeting an opponent he understood, and that changed everything.